The gospel is filled with sayings and stories that are quite challenging to accept. For me, one of the stories that I've found challenging is the story of the woman caught in adultery. This story is found in the Gospel of John, chapter 8, although even this placement has some controversy about it, which I'll address later. In this video, I'm going to explain the challenge I have and what I think is the likeliest solution to it. The text of the story is as follows. But early in the morning he arrived again in the temple area, and all the people started coming to him, and he sat down and taught them. Then the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery and made her stand in the middle. They said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" They said this to test him, so that they could have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and began to write on the ground with his finger. But when they continued asking him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let the one among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again he bent down and wrote on the ground. And in response, they went away one by one, beginning with the elders. So he was left alone with the woman before him. Then Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She replied, "No one, sir." Then Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on do not sin any more." There are several issues with this story that I have difficulty resolving. As a Catholic, I must believe that all of inspired Scripture is true and cannot be mistaken, nor can it mislead us about issues concerning faith and morals. But I know this by faith, although that faith doesn't always mean that I know the answer to how to resolve particular issues that sometimes come out of reading the Bible. The first issue is that it almost seems here like Jesus is disobeying the law of Moses or even encouraging others to disobey it. Jesus came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Although Christians today are not required to obey Moses' laws, unless those laws are also taught by the church, such as in the Ten Commandments, nevertheless, Jesus himself faithfully followed the laws of the Old Covenant. When he healed a leper, he told the leper to go show himself to the priest, just as the law in Leviticus said. He kept the Jewish Passover. He didn't eat unclean foods. He honored the Saturday Sabbath. After he resurrected and the apostles began their mission, gradually the church came to realize that it no longer needed to follow many of those things. But in the life of Jesus himself, he still kept the law. He told the Jews that divorce and remarriage was adultery, and claimed that Moses had permitted divorce for them because of their hardness of heart, but it was still against the divine will. Jesus didn't criticize Moses' allowance in this, but he held his disciples to a higher standard. But in this story in John, Jesus told people not to follow what Moses commanded. Moses said that adulterers needed to be put to death. This was a command, not an allowance. If the Jews refused to execute adulterers, then they were violating what Moses commanded. In other words, they were breaking the old covenant if they failed to carry this out. This is not similar to what Jesus said about divorce. Moses permitted divorce. He didn't command divorce. This was an allowance, not a command. If Jews chose to remain unmarried after separation, they violated nothing in the law by doing this. But when Moses said that adulterers needed to be put to death, this was a command. Israelites needed to execute adulterers. Otherwise, they sinned against the old covenant themselves. Moses commanded this, but Jesus said that only those who were sinless could carry out this command. Jesus doesn't actually say that you can't carry out the command, but only that sinners could not carry it out. This matches other parts of Christ's teaching. He teaches in the Sermon on the Mount that you must remove the beam in your own eye before you can see clearly to remove the speck in your neighbor's eye. And that is essentially the same thing as saying that you need to free yourself from sin before you can judge someone else's sin. But I personally find it challenging to reconcile this with the Old Covenant for several reasons. Firstly, and perhaps the most obvious reason, why would God tell the Israelites to carry out all these punishments in the Old Law if he didn't want any of them to ever carry them out? Everyone has sinned, as the Bible tells us, and the Old Testament itself bears witness. There is no one who can claim to be without sin. But God commanded the Israelites to execute adulterers, idolaters, blasphemers, etc. Why would God order them to do something that he never wanted them to ever do, and then leave them completely in the dark about the fact that he never wanted them to do it, so that they carried out the commands for centuries and didn't know that what they were doing was wrong until Jesus appeared and taught them? Although God has high expectations for us and expects us to search for him with all of our hearts, I think it is a bit of a stretch to think that he expected people to be so wise that they somehow would realize that he didn't want them to do what he had told them to do. God knew the people of Israel were sinners. The people of Israel knew that they were sinners. The people of Israel knew that God knew they were sinners. Why would they think that God hadn't meant for them to carry out these executions when he ordered them to carry them out on account of their sinfulness? If we even just use a secular example, you can understand the absurdity of this. Suppose a father told his son to drive the family car, but both the father and the son know plainly that the son didn't have a license to drive. And then the son drives the car, and when he returns, the father is upset and tells the son, "You only should have started driving that when you got your license." Secondly, there are certain stories in the Old Testament that make little sense within this interpretation. For example, consider this story from the book of Numbers. While Israel was living at Shittim, the people degraded themselves by having illicit relations with the Moabite women. These then invited the people to the sacrifices of their God, and the people ate of the sacrifices and worshipped their God. When Israel thus submitted to the rites of Baal of Peor, the Lord's anger flared up against Israel. And he said to Moses, "Gather all the leaders of the people, and hold a public execution of the guilty ones before the Lord, that his blazing wrath may be turned away from Israel." So Moses told the Israelite judges, "Each of you shall kill those of his men who have submitted to the rites of Baal of Peor." Yet a certain Israelite came and brought in a Midianite woman to his clansmen in the view of Moses and of the whole Israelite community, while they were weeping at the entrance of the meeting tent. When Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, saw this, he left the assembly, and taking a lance in hand, followed the Israelite into his retreat, where he pierced the pair of them, the Israelite and the woman. Thus the slaughter of Israelites was checked, but only after 24,000 had died. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned my anger from the Israelites by his zeal for my honor among them. That is why I did not put an end to the Israelites for the offense to my honor." The people of Israel sinned against the Lord by having relations with Gentile women, who invited the Israelites to worship their gods. God was angry, and so he orders Moses to hold public executions. Should Moses have then said that he cannot obey the Lord's command because he was a sinner? Should he have said that he could not carry this out until he was redeemed from all of his sins? Should he have told God that he needed to follow what God wanted him to do, not what God told him to do? And then when Phinehas takes the spear and kills the Israelite and the Midianite woman, why did God praise Phinehas? Phinehas was a sinner too. Therefore, this action could not have pleased God, since only the sinless could carry out executions that were pleasing to God. Why would God's anger have been checked by this? Shouldn't his anger then have increased instead? This is not the only story in the Old Testament that one could reference on this point. God tells Moses to kill a man who was caught collecting firewood on the Sabbath. Samuel condemns Saul for not killing the kings he captured and says that he is no longer fit to be king. If Christ is right that one must not carry out executions unless one is sinless, then I don't understand how to reconcile that with what the Old Testament teaches. It is not possible that the Gospel and the Old Testament could contradict each other. If there's a seeming contradiction, then it must be something we have misunderstood about one or both. I have a possible solution to this, which I'll get to later, but first I'll show the second challenge I have with this story in John. The second issue is this teaching seems to fly in direct contradiction with what the church teaches today concerning governance. We still punish criminals now. The church today has repudiated capital punishment, but the church has not repudiated the judgment and punishment of criminals. But if we really take what Christ is saying here to its logical conclusion, then how can we punish anyone? If we need to be sinless before we can throw the first stone, then doesn't that mean that every convict must be released from prison? Every criminal must be allowed to walk free. The justice system, judges, juries, police, or any authority at all must all stop punishing people for wrongdoing, because after all, we are sinners too. If you need to be sinless before you have a right to punish others, then we cannot carry out justice in society until we are perfect. But that is not what the church teaches. The church doesn't say that it is against the gospel for countries to put murderers in prison or to give fines to people who don't make the proper customs declaration. Even though the people who are issuing such punishments are not without sin, the church teaches that it is acceptable to do this. We could even take this further and go beyond just the level of political authority. Teachers can't punish students who misbehave in class, because after all, the teachers are sinners too. Parents can't discipline their children, because after all, the parents are sinners too. Only the sinless have a right to cast the first stone, so we must refrain from punishing anyone for anything until we have fully put our own houses in order. And Christ's teaching here is not only denying the law of Moses, but it is also refuting the current teaching of the church. It is actually overturning the entire basis of the legitimacy of governance everywhere. But those conclusions are not acceptable. It can't be true that Christ told people to disobey the laws of Moses while those laws were still in effect before his crucifixion, just as it can't be true that Christ told people something that contradicts the teaching of the church he founded. I think that the best way to resolve this is by taking an interpretation that is perhaps not common for this story. It goes as follows. When Christ said, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone," he didn't mean completely 100% sinless, but rather he meant let the one who was not guilty of sin that deserved death to cast the first stone. Furthermore, he meant only the first stone needed to be cast by the innocent one. The second and following stones could be cast by anyone, including those who were also guilty of sins that deserve death. Let me explain now why this interpretation makes sense to me. In the Sermon on the Mount, Christ said that you will be judged in the way that you judge others. Hence, if you cast judgment on someone, but you do the same thing, then you will receive the same judgment that you put on the other person. But suppose I'm only guilty of some small sin, like perhaps I tell small lies that cause very little damage to anyone, but this other person is guilty of defrauding old people of their life savings with his lies. I have no right to say that this person should be punished because he is a liar, since I'm a liar too. But I can say that he should be punished for using lies to destroy the lives of people, because I haven't done this. In that case, I am applying a standard to him, which I fulfill myself. Even though I am a sinner, I can still cast judgment as long as I am not guilty of the things that I am judging in others. In reality, many of us cast judgment on others while not being truly honest with ourselves about our own failings. But the principle still holds here. As long as you're not guilty of what you judge in others, then you won't be judged yourself because of your judging. You shouldn't put criminals in jail if you did something that should send you to jail too, but if you only did something that deserved a fine, then you can still send the criminal to jail and not be guilty of hypocrisy. Now, in reality, many legal systems and authorities do indeed practice this kind of hypocrisy. Parents and teachers punish children for faults which they themselves often possess. We punish people for breaking contracts, while we don't keep the promises we made to our spouses or families. We put murderers in prison, but we practice abortion. We are sinners casting the first stone when we do those things and yet punish people, and Christ will judge us for it. But as long as you meet your own standard, Christ will not fault us as being sinners for judging or punishing when someone does something wrong. If I am right in my interpretation, Christ was not saying that this woman couldn't be put to death. He was only saying that those particular people in front of him that day were not the ones who could put her to death, because they had done something themselves that deserved death. As I said, I also think that Christ only meant the first stone here, not the second, third, or following stones. That is because the first stone is the stone that has judged the person is worthy of death. All stones that follow are just assisting the first stone to carry out that judgment. Let me put it like this. If a righteous person had the right to punish a sinner with death when he broke the law of Moses, then that man could cast the first stone. But it would take a long time if the man just relied on his own throwing of stones to kill the person being executed. Suppose the righteous man asked others to help him throw stones to carry out this execution. The man being executed is going to die regardless, but it is just a question of how long it is going to take. I don't think it matters then whether the people assisting the righteous man are righteous themselves in that case, or whether they themselves have guilt that deserves death, because they're not really making the decision about whether this person is going to die, but they're just making it so that the death can occur more quickly and conveniently than would otherwise happen. They are not the ones passing judgment. They are just helping the first man to carry out his judgment. When God told Moses to kill the man who collected firewood on the Sabbath, he said that the whole congregation needed to stone him. Obviously, there were probably many people in the congregation who likely had committed great sins themselves that deserved death, but just hadn't been caught doing it. But since they were not the first ones casting stones, because Moses himself would lead them, therefore they could still stone the man and help Moses carry out the Lord's judgment. The same is true of justice systems or punishments of authorities in other cases. A policeman might be a bad man who deserves to be in prison himself, but the moral law does not forbid him from enforcing laws and carrying out judgments that he didn't make himself. The authority who makes the laws and gives the command to arrest or imprison someone is the one casting the first stone here. The policeman is just helping those authorities to carry out their will. The authority who makes the laws or passes the judgments should not be guilty of what they are obliging others to obey. Politicians who pilfer millions in public funds should not be making laws to arrest homeless people who shoplift from grocery stores. But even if they do make such laws, the judicial system that carries out the laws is not guilty of sin in itself by enforcing those laws, because they are only helpers who are casting the second and subsequent stones. In summary, it seems to me that the only way to reconcile this part of the gospel with both church teaching and the Old Testament is if you believe that Christ wasn't actually forbidding this woman from being stoned by the Jews, but he just meant that these particular people couldn't be the ones to cast the first stone since they deserved to die themselves. Now, there is another possibility perhaps that I can explore here to resolve this story other than the interpretation I've made already. Biblical scholars and people who are very familiar with the Bible may know this, although for most people, you may not realize it unless you pay close attention to the footnotes or endnotes in your Bible, because there is evidence that this story in John chapter 8 may not have been in the original manuscripts of the Gospel of John. Some of the earliest manuscripts of John don't have this story in it at all. And if you actually look at the previous chapter and connect it together with what happens after this story, you can easily see how naturally it flows if this story isn't in the text. The guards answered, "Never before has anyone spoken like this one." So the Pharisees answered them, "Have you also been deceived? Have any of the authorities or the Pharisees believed in him? But this crowd, which does not know the law, is accursed." Nicodemus, one of their members who had come to him earlier, said to them, "Does our law condemn a person before it first hears him and finds out what he is doing?" They answered and said to him, "You are not from Galilee also, are you? Look and see that no prophet arises from Galilee." Jesus spoke to them again, saying, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." So the Pharisees said to him, "You testify on your own behalf, so your testimony cannot be verified." Jesus answered and said to them, "Even if I do testify on my own behalf, my testimony can be verified because I know where I came from and where I am going. But you do not know where I come from or where I am going. You judge by appearances, but I do not judge anyone. And even if I should judge, my judgment is valid because I am not alone, but it is I and the Father who sent me. Even in your law, it is written that the testimony of two men can be verified. I testify on my behalf, and so does the Father who sent me." If you delete this story about the woman caught in adultery, then the story that comes after looks like it is a continuation of this scene in chapter 7 when Jesus was in the temple, speaking to the crowds and being challenged by the Pharisees. Many biblical scholars today have been convinced that this story in John 8 about the woman in adultery was a later addition that was inserted in the middle of this story. The Greek in the story seems to match the other Gospels more than it does John, and some of the earliest manuscripts have this story attached to the end of the Gospel of Luke rather than here in the Gospel of John. It's traditionally in John's Gospel, however, because this is where it is in the Latin Vulgate. The Church from the time of the Council of Trent has officially endorsed the Latin Vulgate as containing no doctrinal or theological errors, and that it should be treated as wholly inspired, including every part of it. Here is the actual text of the relevant decree from Trent. But if anyone receive not, as sacred and canonical, the said books entire with all their parts, as they have been used to be read in the Catholic Church, and as they are contained in the old Latin Vulgate edition, and knowingly and deliberately contemn the traditions aforesaid, let him be anathema. Now in modern times, there actually are pieces of the Vulgate that are excluded from many modern Bibles. Here is arguably the most notable of them. And an angel of the Lord descended at certain times into the pond, and the water was moved. And he that went down first into the pond after the motion of the water was made whole of whatsoever infirmity he lay under. And there was a certain man there that had been 38 years under his infirmity. Him when Jesus had seen lying, and knew that he had been now a long time, he saith to him, Wilt thou be made whole? The infirm man answered him, Sir, I have no man, when the water is troubled, to put me into the pond. For whilst I am coming, another goeth down before me. Jesus saith to him, Arise, take up thy bed, and walk. And immediately the man was made whole. And he took up his bed, and walked. And it was the Sabbath that day. That fourth verse about the angels stirring the water is missing from many modern Bibles, because scholars today doubt that it was part of the original text. The Vulgate had this verse in it for many centuries, including the version of the Bible that was endorsed at Trent, but modern biblical scholars determined that it didn't seem to be part of the earliest manuscripts, so it was taken out. If that verse can be removed or deemed non-canonical, then perhaps the story of the woman caught in adultery can be removed or deemed non-canonical too. If the doubts of scholars is enough to change the canon about this one verse, then why cannot it also be enough to change the story in John chapter 8? However, I have the opinion that modern translations and bishops' conferences which are approving them that remove that story about the angels stirring the water may indeed be in violation of what was said at Trent when they did that. Trent said that if anyone does not receive the books with all their parts as they have been read in the Catholic Church, then that person should be anathema. John 5 verse 4 is one of the parts of the Vulgate Bible as was used everywhere in the Latin Church throughout the Middle Ages. Furthermore, it was quoted by church fathers, including Ambrose and Augustine in the early church. Although some translations and bishops' conferences have approved removing it, in deference to modern scholars, I am hesitant to think that they are correct because of what Trent said here. It shouldn't matter how much doubt that scholars have about something. If that thing was in the canon approved at Trent, no bishop's conference or approved translation should be deleting it, at least in my own fallible opinion. But if they are correct that that verse can be removed, then maybe it is possible to remove the story of the woman caught in adultery from John 8:2. And maybe that is a second solution to my challenge about this story. In final conclusion, I don't know for certain whether my solution is correct or not. If you think you know a better way to explain the challenge I presented that comes out of this story, please share in the comments below. The sayings and actions of Jesus are meant to be challenging to us. They are meant to get us to reflect on our ways and change them. If what he told us was easy to accept and understand, then it wouldn't have been the gospel.